Welcome to the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And it's gorgeous weather outside, so I'm glad that you are here and not someplace else. Okay? I'm Dr. Mark Foxall with the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice here. What a wonderful place to work and a wonderful place to be educated. Right, students? Thank you very much. Okay? We're going to get right down to business today because we have a wonderful panel here today, and we have a lot of good invited guests here today. Again, I want to thank you for coming. I would like to acknowledge, before we get into the content for tonight, some of the people that are responsible for helping us host this event tonight. First of all, and I don't know where she's at because she's disappeared. Oh, there she is, Dr. Gayleen Armstrong, the Dean of the College of Public Affairs and Community Service. I would also like to acknowledge and introduce our Director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, Dr. Todd Armstrong. Thank you for coming in tonight. I would also like to recognize a few of our dignitaries who are in the room tonight. First of all, a longtime friend of mine, yes, the chair of the Nebraska State Board of Parole, Ms. Rosalind Cotton. And I see the chief of the University of Nebraska Police Department here as well, Chief Charlotte Evans. I see the deputy chief of the Omaha Police Department is here, Steve Cerveny. Thank you for coming tonight. And another longtime friend of mine, the chief of trauma acute care surgery at the University of Nebraska Medicine, or Nebraska Medicine. I always get those two mixed up. Dr. Charlotte Evans. And did I miss anybody? No. You know, I also have to acknowledge the person that really behind the scenes and making tonight happen, and that is Ellen Freeman Wakefield. Where is she? There's a force unto herself. Ellen? Oh, where is she? There she is, Ellen Freeman Wakefield. Thank you for coming tonight. Ellen's worked very hard to put this together tonight, and I want to acknowledge her and the work that has done to make this, to pull this off tonight. And then I'm going to hand this over to another. Oh, Jenna, there you go. Oh, you know, Jenna, a hand for you as well. Thank you. Just trying to make the room and see everybody in here, but there's a lot of people behind the scenes that try to pull these things off. So I'm going to turn the dais over to Weysan Dun, retired special agent in charge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, without a doubt the finest law enforcement agency in the world, and he is going to lead the panel tonight. Special Agent Weysan Dun.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate that. So we'll start by asking the panel members to each give them a brief introduction of themselves, and then we'll ask Chief Schmaderer to talk a little bit about why he wrote the book, and we'll go from there. We have a number of questions that have been submitted in advance, but if we have time, and I'm confident we will, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience in the second half of this evening's proceedings. So first of all, just as far as myself, I am retired from the FBI. I spent 30 years in the FBI, and then I'm currently serving as a commissioner on the Nebraska Crime Commission. But when I was asked to be the facilitator for this panel, I was thrilled because what most of my law enforcement colleagues don't know is that before I joined the FBI, I actually worked for 4 years as a radio news reporter. So I've been on both sides of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. So our panel members, starting from my right, your left, are Professor Adam Tyma, Waverle Monroe, anchor for WOWT, Chief KETV. Sorry, KETV. Okay. I should know that. And then Chief Todd Schmaderer, and then Professor Justin Nix. So I'll ask each of them to briefly identify themselves and give a short bio. So Professor Tyma, we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Dr. Adam Tyma. I am a professor of what is called critical media studies in the School of Communication here at UNO. I have been conducting research into, let's call it media, in all ways and forms. This evening in particular, I'll be looking at basically the intersection of public relations, news, reporting, risk, and crisis communication, and looking at the intersection of that as it relates to Chief Schmaderer's book and kind of insights from there. So that's where I'm coming from.
Wonderful. Waverle?
Yes, hello. My name is Waverle Monroe. I am an anchor reporter at KETV, Omaha's news leader. I've been here, well, I'm a UNO grad first and foremost, so happy to be back on campus.
All right.
And then also, I've been working at KTV since 2017, so in various different roles. So I'm here as the media correspondent, I guess, to provide the perspective of what it looks like behind the camera, in front of the camera, when interacting with law enforcement.
Okay, Chief Schmaderer, I know everybody knows who you are, but if you want to share a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Weysan. First of all, I wanted to just really thank UNO from start to finish. They've been behind me with this book and putting this panel together, so thank you. The one thing, it's after being 13-year chief in the city of Omaha, it's nice to look out at this room, and I know somebody from every table. When I first started, I didn't know anybody, so that's kind of a pleasure of mine to look up and see all these familiar faces. Just educationally, I graduated from the University of Nebraska at Omaha, graduated with a criminal justice degree. I went on to the University of Cincinnati where I got a master's degree, and then I went to the FBI's National Executive Institute, which is a course that they put on for executives, anybody in law enforcement that supervises more than 500 people. And that incredible background with that particular course. So educationally, that's my background. Professionally, believe it or not, I think I'm the longest serving major city chief right now in the country. It's interesting. When I started, I had zero gray hairs. Now I have to cut my side super short so you can't see it all. And I go into the room still, and they'll mention, hey, he's the longest serving major city chief. Yet the new ones they're hiring are still older than I am at this point. So I've had the fortune or misfortune, I don't know what the situation is there, but when I started at 39, I had the opportunity just to see a lot of things in the city. Oversaw a couple serial killer investigations, a couple police corruption scandals, various other things. And the one thing that struck me very early on in my career is there was zero preparation, zero instruction on how to deal with the media. And so I'll get into that in the next section, but I just wanted to throw those highlights out about my background and really just thank everybody for coming.
Very good. And then next is Professor Justin Nix.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Justin Nix. I'm an associate professor here in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And for 10 years now, I've been doing research on police-community relations and things like the use of deadly force by officers, looking at trends across cities and jurisdictions in the United States, understanding patterns therein, as well as some research on how police balance, the need to be transparent with the community in the interest of building trust versus, do things like preserve the integrity of ongoing investigations and the like. So it's a delicate balance that Chief Schmaderer and others in our country have to deal with. And so I come at this book as someone who's been, I've never been a police officer, I've never been a journalist, but as an academic, I've got my finger on the pulse of, what the research tells us about these issues. And as an educator, this book, it really excites me because there are, it's packed with locally salient examples that I can use in the classroom. I find myself often thinking back to when I was in grad school and using examples maybe that don't click with students, a lot of whom are local or from near Omaha, and so I look forward to discussing some of these examples that the chief goes through and provides powerful examples of how to be a leader and how to communicate with the media. during those types of events. So I look forward to talking more tonight.
All right, thank you. And to the audience, you're really in for a unique treat, and my compliments to UNO for assembling this panel, because it's rare that you get to dive into the issues we're going to talk about today from both the academic and theoretical standpoint, as well as from the standpoint of those who are practitioners of these professions on a daily basis. And with this panel, you've got both. Very accomplished people on all sides. So Todd, do you want to provide any more information about why you chose to write the book? I know you already talked about that a little bit.
Sure, I'll add a little bit to it. So when I was a deputy chief for about 3 years under Chief Alex Hayes, and when Alex retired, it was a little unexpected. He left a little earlier than we had anticipated. He had something he wanted to do, and they opened it up to a national police chief search. And I got a lot of people that came to me and said, hey, we'd like you to put your name in, submit your name. Went through the process, which was, a very arduous process, was fortunate to come out on top. And day one as chief, I thought, okay, I'll be managing the inside of the organization. I'll have a crime strategy. I'll work with the community. We'll get some things done. Boom, right out of the chute, there's a police corruption scandal. We had some officers steal a cell phone to cover up some of the things that they were doing, and the media dubbed it a 33rd and Seward public corruption scandal. And so right out of the chute, right in the middle of a mayoral election for a new chief that just got appointed, I have to deal with this police corruption scandal. It involves my employees. Find myself at the end of that, we end up having to terminate about 4 to 6 officers. Had to have a press conference for the world to see. Thought to myself, wow, it would have been great if I had some instruction, some knowledge of what I could be doing here with the media, because clearly this is a lot different than I had anticipated. A couple months later, a serial killer strikes again in Omaha and kills 2 people in 2013, but had previously killed 2 people in 2008. And so instantly we're thrust into this serial killer investigation. Very concerned about him killing again. Finally, we make an arrest on that. We have tremendous detectives in the Omaha Police Department. Again, big, huge national media story. 2 weeks later, another serial killer. This one's name was Nico Jenkins. He's always in the news, it seems. I think everybody probably knows him. So I started thinking at myself at this time, there needs to be somebody within our profession that instructs or lays out what can be done with how to work with the media, not just on the highest crisis levels, but your baseline media strategies as well. So I started looking. I could find no instruction anywhere. I couldn't find a course on it. There was a few entities that would come in for 3-4 days and teach, but there was no college curriculum on this at all. So I started keeping notes, started kind of really archiving this book for the last 10 years before I really buckled down and started writing it. And then boom, I made the decision to have the TV show Cops come into Omaha. And, as misfortune would have it, we got caught up in a friendly fire situation. One of my officers killed the cameraman. Boom, national story again. But at this point, I've already been through 3 national stories, and I was prepared. I was on my game. And right before going into that press conference, I can tell you that every big name in the civil rights world had contacted me. They basically said, Chief, we got our eyes on you. You know why? It's 15 days after Ferguson, Missouri, Michael Brown incident. And so I had been kind of keeping notes on this book, how to work with the media, how to conduct our investigation and relay it to the public. And because of some of the things that I had learned previously, I felt that press conference went over very well. And it saved Omaha from a lot of scrutiny, maybe the civil unrest that Ferguson had. So that further entrenched to me, this book needs to be written. Mark Foxall and I, we go way back, and Weysan Dun goes way back with me as well. But Mark and I would meet about every 6 months for lunch. I would bounce big things off him. I knew he had an executive mindset. You got to have somebody you can bounce things off of at all times. Never operate in a silo. Somebody needs to be able to tell you, settle down or speed up. Mark did that for me. As I got closer to what I thought was going to be the end of my career, I thought, let's put this in a book. I reached out to Mark. He liked the idea. He thought it would be a great college curriculum. He was a little shocked that it hasn't been taught either. So we worked on this book. I wrote the book, and Mark would give me a ton of guidance on it. And in January, I think it was November 2024, I became the author of Synergy of Influence. And at this point, we're really looking forward to it being in its first class in August of this year at UNO. And that's the background as to why I wrote the book. I can't wait to get into some of these examples. I was talking to Waverle earlier. She had some great counterpoints on me. I can't wait to hear her counterpoints. Those WWT reporters, they'll do that. I'm going to end with that, Weysan.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, first of all, let me just say, I have read the book. I think you can tell with all the tabs I put into it, and I found it to be very enlightening. Todd captures and puts into a very logical and easily understandable format a lot of lessons that I also learned in my 30-year career. I've been on national media a number of times and have the bruises and the bumps to show for that as well. So I thought it was a very, very well-written book and very much needed, because you're right, there's not a lot of training for law enforcement executives on terms of how to deal with the media. So I'd like to go by and ask each of the panel members to briefly talk about their overall perception of the book, and then we'll get into some questions and answers. So again, we'll start with Professor Tyma.
Hi, cool. I'm in the midst of grading towards finals, therefore the readers had to come out fully today. As I said, my area of research really delves into media and culture, media and society. How do they interact? Where do they exist? Another area that I have been involved with is the idea of understanding risk and crisis events and looking at what happens when you have something like Chief Schmaderer was talking about occurring. What practices are in place? How are the different publics involved? What are the implications of that? And so I'm kind of coming at this from that perspective. So after I've gone through the book, I was reading over the last month or so, tearing it apart, because I tear things apart, it's what I do. And I've got thoughts, and I'm going to organize them in three areas. First one is what I'm going to call stakeholders. And the reason I call them that is because and I think the Chief does a nice job talking about this in the book, in any kind of media environment, any kind of messaging environment, we need to identify our stakeholders. That seems pretty commonplace. That seems like not a big deal. What happens, though, is we forget many of them. We stop thinking about the various nonprofits that are in existence. We stop thinking about the various non-governmental entities that are in existence. We stop thinking about other law enforcement entities that are in existence. All of the different spaces, community leaders, neighborhood associations, schools, they all intersect. And in a moment of crisis or in a moment of messaging, if you do not account for all of those, there's going to be a mess. There's going to be a miss somewhere. And so the first thing I like about this, but Texas, the Chief does talk into it, and I just kind of want to expand on some things. The idea of looking at non-media audiences, stakeholders, and identifying them. You want to make sure that you identify them before. You want to make sure that you identify them before the event occurs. Do the reaching out, do the talking, do the one-on-one conversations. Develop those relationships so that in the moment something occurs, you're ready to go. You want to begin fostering those because you're going to develop, the term that you use in the book, a peer relationship. The relationship that's in the book discusses peer relationship with media, with reporters, with news anchors, with news directors, things of that nature. But you need to develop that with all of your stakeholders because that allows for a better messaging environment. The second thing I want to bring up is, and this is the reality of the world, work under the assumption you will not be 100% in control of your message. It just will not happen. You will try your best. The reality is the more you try and the more you try to stranglehold it, the worse it is going to slide out of your control. Rather, work with your different constituencies, work with those various stakeholders you've identified to ensure the message lands in all the spaces it needs to land. And that's one of the big takeaways from me as I was reading through this. So stakeholders is the first thing. The second thing I want to talk about is the idea of developing and revising SOP, or standard operating procedure. This is something that I was in a previous life, I was a corporate guy. And so in that corporate environment, we had SOPs for everything. So we were always in the act of revising them. The same applies here, particularly when you talk about public relations, when you talk about messaging, when you talk about crisis events, when you talk about risk events. Understanding and developing an SOP in advance, respecting the fact that it's going to change. If you try to go straight to the rule every time, it's not going to work every time. Rather, flexibility is key. The media training you were talking about, that the 2 or 3 day workshops that people come in and do, they sit everyone in a room. This is how to talk to a camera. This is how to talk to a mic. This is how to say this or that or the other thing. Those are great to start. But it is the continual development, the continual relationship developing that is going to make it work better. So understanding and developing those SOPs over time, and then learning how to revise them. Have an after action. Have a reflection. Take a look at the event that occurred, how did it occur, what went right, what went wrong, adapt and change. If you can do that, you're going to be amazed at how well any event moment will go for you. This leads to an idea that we talk about in media research and in risk and crisis communication called image restoration. The idea of image restoration is quite simple. There's a bunch of theoretical over here that I'm not going to get into. The basics of it are as follows. We walk into any space with a particular image or identity constructed around us that we speak through. Typically, it holds up. If you've done the work, if you've done the prep work, you're good to go. On occasion, though, that image falls. The media doesn't like what you're talking about. I used the term media. I shouldn't have done that. I hate that phrase. Anyways, messaging, the report, what you're trying to get out there doesn't work. Something happens. The image you're trying to construct falls. So what do? You go through a process of restoration. Restoration doesn't mean the same thing as it ever was. It does not mean it's going to be the same thing every time. It's not possible. What it does mean, however, is through that process of reflection, you're able to develop and possibly foster a stronger image, a stronger relationship with those other stakeholders. Again, I think the chief speaks to that in the book. I'm trying to kind of bring some ideas out further so we can have the conversation going. The third thing is the thing I just said, is the thing I cannot stand, is the phrase, the media. I teach classes from intro to mass comm to graduate seminars in media theory and all points in between. And the first thing I tell my students the first day is the phrase, the media, I want you to wipe it out of your mind. Get rid of it, because that assumes the media is a monolith and a Goliath. It is not. There are media channels. There are media spaces. There are newspapers and television stations and radio stations and online spaces and blog spaces and Facebook groups and TikTok channels. And all of those are various mediated spaces. But when you say the media, you start to think everything's going to work all in one. Remove that from your mind. You've got to get rid of that. Rather, understand how each of them work, which gets back into the fostering conversations. Understand what each of them is looking for. Have the conversation in advance to get to know your news directors in your space. How do they work? How do they function? What's their management strategy look like? How do they how they're going to set up their shows? One of the things we were talking about before the session started was that in any 30-minute news block, fun fact, you get 22 minutes of actual airtime. 8 minutes for commercials. Of that time, we live in Nebraska, eliminate between 5 and 7 of that for news and Huskers. Let's call it what it is. Actually, weather and Huskers. So you've got 2 blocks up top. Those blocks are going to run you anywhere from 3 to 7 minutes apiece on the outside, depending on how they're moving. And then you've got your last block at the end. That's it. Any given day, 100+ stories a day. How do you choose the 5? How do you choose the 10 if you're lucky? Understanding how the various news sources do that choice is going to help you develop those conversations as you go. And if I was going to say add something into the conversation in the text, and I want to bring it up here, is really working on those nuances. It's all about the little things here and there and seeing how they function. I'm looking through my other notes here, and the one last thing I want to talk about, and I'm really excited that Schmaderer brought these up. In this book here, this is Theorizing Crisis Communication, Tim Selnow and Matt Seeger. Tim Selnow is currently at Clemson. Matt Seeger is currently at Wayne in Detroit. They are two of the top scholars in risk and crisis comm in the country right now. They break down the questions to ask before, during, and after an event. I'm going to go through them quickly so you kind of get a sense of what to be asking. Number one, what is the threat? Always identify it. Know what it is, know how it's going to happen before it's going to happen. This goes into the prep work, right? Two, what is or are the predicted impacts of that thing occurring? And then, what is the actual impact? So that's that reflection point, right? Three, what is the essence of the crisis? Drill down, get to the understanding everything going on there. That means more than just a surface knee-jerk reaction. Really get into it. Four, what are the needs of the various audiences? That's where understanding stakeholders comes into play. Understanding who the players are in the room, who are the players in the community, and that means all of them. When you think about what happened in Elkhorn last spring when the tornadoes went through. Last fall we had a panel, our Risk and Crisis one-day seminar on campus, and the woman who runs National Weather Service out there on Valley came and spoke with us about this. And she walked us through all those things. There were things I didn't realize that they were talking about every day. You didn't know that stuff. So get to know that stuff so you can understand what's happening. Who are those audiences? What are various organizational needs, internal and external? What might be policy implications of whatever event is occurring? What are your messages? What are your actual messages? That's where an SOP comes into play. If you can identify those in advance, how they're constructed, how they're formed, who they go to, who they don't go to, different messaging for different audiences, it's going to help you out. Let's see, what is the crisis type? You should probably know what's happening, right? What media are appropriate? Sorry. Some media are maybe not be appropriate for a space. Some are. Who, when, how should you figure that out? And then what is or are your sources of information, both internal and external? These are the questions to be thinking about, and I see them discussed throughout the book here and there. I wanted to give them one spot. Because if you can ask these questions in prep, during, and after, it's going to help in these kind of spaces. I have other notes that we're going to talk about throughout the course of the evening, but I'll stop there and hand over to Waverle. So, thank you.
All right, so I am not a researcher, believe it or not. So I am going to just go with what I have in my notes here. But I did grow up in Omaha, Nebraska, so I have a soft spot for Omaha, and covering Omaha has been a huge honor, and I'm very passionate about telling stories here in my community. And so, when I first started at KETV, I had about a year under my belt in Duluth, Minnesota, the icebox of America. So coming back home was nice. I didn't have to.
I'm from Minnesota. It's a lovely place.
I didn't have to wear my winter coat 3/4 of the year, which was really cool. And so I was considered a general assignment reporter when I first started. And so I worked first news weekends and then first news, which was meaning I was starting my day at 3:30 in the morning usually. And my job was to respond many things, but when it involves this, it was to respond to breaking news scenes, including like car wrecks, shootings, death investigations, things that really called for a police response. And so when I got there, it was my job to find out any little information that I could. And when you walk into an active investigation, cops aren't running to tell you everything that's going on. So you call dispatch and you get little things that you can confirm, which is basically like what time a call came in, what kind of call was it, and are there any transports? And that's pretty much all dispatch will tell you. Then it's your job to look at a scene, kind of assess what's going on, also make yourself known to police officers and say, hey, I am going to wait here at the corner of, the crime scene tape to whenever you have a chance to send, your reporting officer down that can come speak to me. That's allowed to, or I guess has clearance. And so, when and let me go to my next page here. There we go. Okay. So that was my first kind of interaction with police officers, which is what I would say is a standard interaction that reporters have. As working at KETV, moving my way up the ranks, I was able to make better connections with officers. I don't interact with them as much on scene, but that doesn't mean that I'm not talking to them behind the scenes. And so when I was reading Chief Schmaderer's book, it was all very familiar to me. I feel like, knowing what to ask them, knowing what I'm gonna get out of them, when talking through processes and things like that, I was like, oh yeah, totally. Like I can totally lay out a majority of the conversations that I have with Neil Bonacci, the PIO, then what he's going to tell me and what he's not going to tell me. And he's going to say, well, he'll look at me and say, ask someone else. I'm not going to, I can't tell you that, so, but we have that, connection. So I want to share a short story because I am a storyteller. So stories are my thing. When I was reading the first chapter and Carrie Roscoe was brought up, she's the, officer that was killed most recently, very tragically. And I wanted to speak to someone who was actually there. And my colleague Melissa Fry was, and she was actually the first reporter on scene after we had heard the call come through over the scanners that are in our newsroom. And the reason she was the first one is because she was only a couple blocks away covering like Omaha Gives, which, if you know what that is, that's a very lighthearted story. So to get a call that you need to go 2 blocks down for an officer that's been shot, it just kind of puts you in a little bit of a tailspin. So she talks about coming on scene. They didn't even have the police tape up yet because had just happened. It was very chaotic, and she knew from the moment she got there that she knew that there was SWAT on scene because she could see it. She knew there were regular police officers. And so she said that it just felt extremely tense and very different from any other officer involved shooting situation that she had been to, and she knew that something very serious had happened just based off of body language. And then she says that it's different than she had ever seen before. And Schmaderer, in the book, you referred to the media response as being as rabid, which you did talk about earlier. But when I asked Fry about this, she said it's just because we needed to be everywhere. If you imagine you're at a crime scene and it spans 6 blocks, if we're there before a media staging area is made, we don't know which end of the scene to go on. So maybe I call my people back at the desk and I say, hey, can you send another crew out here? I'm trying to get police, but they're busy over here. I think there might be other police on the other side. So we stage it that way so that we don't miss anything. Because while we are trying to handle a very chaotic scene and be respectful, we also have a job to do, and that's to get the story, to get it out to you guys. And so we did have crews at the hospital. We had crews on scene, and then I believe we were in the process of sending a crew to the Omaha Police Officers Union. And I wanted to bring up this too because I remember you talking about when you came to the hospital, you said it was just a lot. Seeing, news cameras there and everything like that, when you're trying to handle something that obviously was very monumental and unprecedented. And so Melissa Fry was tasked with going to the police union. And she made a call to call the union president at the time. And she said, hey, I know you guys are going through a lot, but they're trying to send me here. Do you want us to come? And he's like, absolutely not. Grieving police officers are coming here. Do not come here. And she was like, all right. But if she didn't have that previous connection with that union president at the time, and she was just a day one reporter, she might have shown up, and then that might have burned a future relationship that she could have had down the line with that with that officer or that union president. And so I say all that to say, I think one of the things in the book that I felt maybe was missing was a media perspective, right? I think that while it was very interesting to hear what goes on from a police perspective, I was thinking in my head about all the times that what I'm doing when police are also doing their job. And so it was a very interesting read, as well as, familiar. And I definitely understand that there is a need for this kind of book, because I often see earlier in my career, I'll never forget, I was working with an officer overnight, and at 3:30 in the morning when a crash comes in and you're hearing that it's a fatality, you need the officer on scene to confirm it for you so that you can go live with it. He never wanted to go on camera. And I was like, okay, I remember begging him one time, being like, please, can I just please record you on my phone? I was like, I don't even have to have a big camera, because his excuse was, well, I don't want to be on camera. Okay, I'm like, well, can I just do this, please? And it's hard because, if you're not going to confirm it officially, then I can't run with it. So people are emailing us, well, why didn't you cover that fatality? Well, because nobody told me, and I know what's going on, but I don't. I can't say it in official capacity. So I think, when we talk about the book in that way, I just think that the book provided a perspective that maybe I didn't have, and I hope that there's an opportunity in the future to maybe provide a perspective that people don't have when it comes to working with news stations and specifically reporters on scene, because it's different calling into a news station and making a connection with a news director or the person at the desk that's assigning the stories. I'm out here coming face to face with officers, and so it's just a different perspective. I'm going to look at my notes here because I feel like, again, I'm going off on tangents, what I told you I would do. I also want to bring up, I was thankful that you addressed race and things like that. As being a Black woman, I mean, that's obviously something that is very high level to me, just through my life experiences, and coverage has changed a lot. I remember when someone would get killed, and we would, I would read stories of old KETV stories about, they're talking about their rap sheets, and I'm like, wait, this person's a victim. Like, why are we talking about, something that happened 10 years prior to them getting, shot and killed, and not by police, but just like any gun violence. So, it has evolved, and I think that was great to provide that perspective. And also, I would say I would love to have heard more about Latinos, the Sudanese community, our refugee community, people who are coming from like war-torn countries who police just don't exist in their country. And so when they come over here, how do you interact with someone like that, and how do you train your officers to? And then also, I know you guys have made strides to hire, Sudanese police officers. I mean, I did a story with Galat, so I know you guys are doing that behind the scenes, and that's great. And so just even highlighting those things, it makes a world of a difference within the police force. And lastly, I want to touch on too, nothing has ever made police feel more human to me than hearing them kind of talk off the cuff. And so I know that's not always an opportunity, but I'll never forget, I was at an officer-involved shooting where there was no one died, thankfully, but it was just chaos. And I remember the officer saying to me, like, this is just, like, our officers are hurting too. Like, this is our community too. And I think that can be said for journalists as well. Like, when we go out into a shooting scene, like, I've lived all over Omaha. Like, when I go out to a shooting in West Omaha, I went to high school at Burke. I responded. My sister was at Burke High School when the stabbing happened a couple years ago. Like, this is our community too. And so, it was nice to hear. It's nice to hear when officers can provide a perspective like yours. And I thought you did a great job of offering your perspective too. And I want to thank you for being human in your book. And we don't get to talk often, so it was nice to kind of hear it in your own words. And so I think I'll leave it at that. And I won't be able to provide much research, but I'll be providing a recount of what I experience when I'm working out with officers.
Okay, thank you, Waverly. And now to Professor Nix.
Thank you. So a little over 10 years ago, when you're dealing with the aftermath of the friendly fire shooting while Cops was filming, I was about 1,000 miles away in a small office about the size of a broom closet with my fiance stuffing 2,000 envelopes full of surveys, which you probably didn't respond to because you had matters to deal with here, but I'll have to go back and check. And I was trying to understand, how do police, much like Adam points out, the media suggests a monolith. How do police communicate with multiple stakeholders within their community, right? We say community as if it's a monolith, but, Waverly actually earlier was talking about ratings suggesting that, viewers in West Omaha maybe want something different from the news than viewers in North Omaha, for example. And so I was really trying to understand, how do police chiefs on the heels of Ferguson understand and communicate with the various stakeholders in their communities, right? And what are their strategies? What do they perceive their role as being in those various communities? And, I wrote my dissertation and, got my PhD and everything. And in the years that ensued, I became more and more into research on, the use of deadly force, right? I remember pretty vividly President Obama and the former FBI director kind of having a public back and forth about, the need for better data on how often police discharge their weapons in the line of duty. And Jim Comey at the time famously said, "I have no idea, and no one in my agency does." And from that was born, the Washington Post began tracking those shootings with their database that is now unfortunately defunct. And my colleagues and I published a paper with that data set, and being so close to Ferguson, I found myself, suddenly getting some attention for this article that got picked up and cited by various news outlets. I found myself talking to the media with no training whatsoever and just kind of flying by the seat of my pants, trying to explain my research in, simple, easy to understand terms. And so I kind of developed a knack for understanding like the bird's eye view of these issues, right? So nationally, with 17,000 some odd state and local police departments, what do deadly force trends look like in the aggregate, right? If we could get a bird's eye view, or what do responses to public unrest by police departments look like from a bird's eye perspective? And what I like about this book is it provides us more of a worm's eye view, right? A case study of, going on 13 years of, thank you, 13 years of navigating these tricky issues, from corruption cases to serial killer cases to, the friendly fire incident, to you tell a story from when you were a younger officer about having to use, to put a dog out of its misery, right? And by and large, it seems like, as someone who studies these issues and has worked in, San Francisco, Phoenix, New York City, Columbia, Louisville, I've been on the ground in these places and seen their tactics and their strategies play out. And by and large, I think the data that we often care a lot about tell a pretty compelling story that what Chief has done here in Omaha, by and large, has worked, right? We, as a city, Omaha experiences relatively few officer-involved shootings on a year-to-year basis compared to many of its peers. We enjoy relatively low crime rates, and OPD boasts a really impressive clearance rate, particularly for homicides and non-fatal shootings. The chief is, he points out in the book that a lot of agencies would love to have a 50% clearance rate, and here in Omaha we've had 2 years now of 100% clearance rates, and that speaks to some level of trust between community and police, and that's not an accident. That's something that I think was very intentionally cultivated by the chief and his command staff. So as a researcher, though, it's a lot like we're looking backward at the garden of forking paths that we've already sort of navigated, right? So at each juncture, faced with each challenge, you took the actions that you took. And we can look back now and appreciate, what worked well. And one thing I think didn't come through as clearly as the things that worked are, I'd like to hear more about things you tried where you feel like you didn't have the same level of success. And I know there are some things in there. It just felt a little asymmetrical to me in terms of, there's more about what worked, as there should be, less about, we tried these things and didn't have the same level of success. So as a researcher, I always want to know that counterfactual, right? So 12, 13 years of Chief Schmaderer's leadership, and he did these things, and we think that these good outcomes are associated with those behaviors. Well, what would have happened at each instance if he'd have done the other thing he was thinking about, right? Or maybe you had 5 options you were looking at. And we can never truly know that, right? But that's why this book is so valuable, because it provides a case study of what happened here in Omaha on the ground, again, a worm's eye view of that dynamic between leadership and personnel in the agency and various forms of media and various sort of voices out in the community, sometimes which have competing expectations or demands of the police, right? So I've always been fascinated by this issue of, leading an agency that has responsibility for providing services to a city of 430,000 people, something like that, 1 million in the metropolitan area. And those voices in the community don't always agree with each other about what the police should or shouldn't be doing, right? Whether the police should or shouldn't adopt body-worn cameras. Whether the chief should or shouldn't release still photos from an ongoing investigation, right? And so that's tricky, right? How do you ensure that, as Adam points out, you're not excluding stakeholders from the discussion, right? It's easy sometimes to feel pressured to respond to the loudest voices in the room, but a lot of times there are voices in the room that you can't hear, either because they're choosing not to speak or they're being drowned out by the louder voices. But you've got to make sure that you keep a seat at the table for them and you're responsive to their concerns as well. So I also have notes because I can ramble and get off topic, and it's a mess here, so apologies. Even my notes don't really keep me on task. But I recall a couple years ago, as I'm sure we all do, that we were in the midst of a global pandemic, and for a while there, you couldn't go outside, right? There were restrictions in place. You know, you had to wear a mask to go certain places, right? It was taboo to leave your home for a while there, even though we never had a stay-at-home order. A lot of places in America did. And again, my colleagues and I fielded this national survey experiment of what people want from their police during this challenging, supposed once-in-a-lifetime event, right? Suddenly, everything's different, right? And so police at the time are balancing this concern about officer safety, but really everyone's safety, right? So every time police go and interact with someone during the early days of the pandemic, they're giving the virus a chance to transmit, right? And so there are good reasons to want to pull back from your responses to various calls for service. And I remember Louisville Metro famously came out and said, we're not going to respond to certain types of calls, including residential burglaries, commercial burglaries, for example. We're going to take those by phone or by video and follow up later. And at the same time, that in some places, police are being asked to enforce social distancing laws, right? And mask mandates. And so we were interested in, what does the average American want from police in these challenging times? And well, the answer was they still expect police to provide some baseline level of service, right? Anyway, in writing that paper, I turned to the literature on emergency management, right, and disaster response. And so, although I agree there's really no sort of one-stop shop for what's in this book and what can be useful for up-and-coming executives in terms of navigating the dynamics that you lay out. I do recall from the emergency management literature, you can sort of break down the response into 3 phases. And one I think you highlight really well is like anticipation phase. You talk about population certainty, right? In Omaha, but even nationally speaking, with a law enforcement system that employs 700,000 individuals across 17,000 some odd agencies, and when the task is to go and police, right, to provide public protection, to respond to crimes after they've occurred and otherwise try to prevent crimes from occurring. When you ask human beings to do this in a country awash in guns, bad things will happen. You could have the best trained agency, you could have the best policies, SOPs on paper, you could do everything right. And at some point, it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when, as the chief articulates, right? Something bad is going to happen. Could be an honest mistake, could be that you hired someone that, in retrospect, maybe you shouldn't have hired, and that was truly a bad apple, and you regret it, right? And then it becomes hard to get rid of them due to various procedures in place, right? But it's so important during the anticipation phase to understand that if things are great today, they might not be great tomorrow, or a year from now, or 5 years from now. And I think here in Omaha, we really need to appreciate the stability we've had in the chief's office. For 12 or 13 years now, to have a steady hand like Chief Schmaderer's is a luxury that most cities don't enjoy. The average chief of police lasts fewer than 5 years in this country, and in major cities, it can turn over a lot more quickly than that. So to have someone at the helm for that length of time, to have that level of experience to draw on is truly, I mean this when I say this, a luxury that a lot of cities don't enjoy. When I was in grad school, I remember at one point there were something like 7 police chiefs over an 8-year period in the city where my university was. And you just can't build up a positive culture in your organization if your organization is constantly watching a different person steer the ship, right? And the last thing they want to do is rock the boat and commit to anything because the new person might come in and say, well, we're doing it this way now. But during that anticipation phase, it's important to, I always go back to that age-old saying, I don't know who said it, but trust is easily gained, or hard to gain, easily lost, right? And so during that anticipation phase, it's so important to, make deposits into the community trust bucket, right? To be proactive, to always, I think, err on the side of being transparent, right? Not to be fearful of how it might get spun on social media or TikTok or on the evening news, right? But to err on the side of like being an open book. In a democratic society, I think that's so important at a time when trust in institutions is at an all-time low. It's really important when things are going well to continue to be proactive about doing things that demonstrate, hey, we're an agency that can be trusted. We're going to be transparent about investigations. We're going to be transparent with our data so that when phase 2 happens, right, when the event happens, you've built up, you've got a lot of trust in that bucket because you're going to lose some, right? But if you've put in the work, people will be willing to hear you out, I think, and not immediately assume the worst, right? And I know that's easy for me to say, having never done the job, but we have a lot of social psychological research that tells us how much that matters. So you've got the anticipation phase, then you've got the response phase. And again, I'm pulling this over from the emergency management literature, so you can think of this as like, living in Omaha. The tornado's on the ground right now, and so what do we do at that moment, right? How do we keep people safe, keep my officers safe, and furthermore anticipate what's going to be the aftermath, right? When that thing goes back up in the sky, what are we going to prioritize, right? We're going to get to the people that need help, right? We want to make sure it's safe to do so, et cetera, et cetera. In the context of, policing in everyday Omaha, everyday America, when the officer-involved shooting happens, what do you want to do, right? So you've got a playbook here about, like, how do you go and set up the media staging, right? What are the things you can say, can't say? How much of that can you delegate to your deputy chiefs, for example? When do you need to be in front of the cameras versus take a step back and not be in front of the cameras? I think these are all great suggestions. And then thinking about the aftermath, right? So after the press staging, dealing with things like the investigation, there are going to be potentially protests, public, people voicing their First Amendment rights, right, to gather and to, voice concerns. So how do you deal with that? I think that's been a really interesting issue over the last few years. How do police have a presence at protests to deal with agitators who may show up, right, or respond to people who may need help versus, knowing when to just kind of be around but out of sight so that the police themselves don't sort of agitate people who are there to protest perceived injustices, right? So I think there's the recipe is in here somewhere. I think it could be to be more convincing to researchers. You might bring in some of the things that didn't work, things that you've tried and don't feel like have been as successful. And I think another thing that's important is to remember, it's always the local context is going to matter, right? So things have worked well here in Omaha, by and large. You've had numerous opportunities for things to go really sideways at times. And from my perspective, things never got super out of hand. I mean, we can think of the 2020 protests and what happened downtown. It wasn't as bad as what occurred in a lot of cities. And so there were multiple opportunities, I think, for societal monumental events to really damage the culture of the agency and damage the trust with the community. And I just haven't seen clear evidence of it the way I've seen in many other cities. So would your playbook work if we picked it up and dropped it down in Kansas City or Charlotte, North Carolina, or anywhere else in America? That remains to be seen, I think. But you've given us a great start and something that other leaders, I think, can look to, like you say, follow what they want to follow, manipulate where they think they need to adjust for their local context, right? It's a great, great starting point. And to boot, a really, interesting read. Like, there's something to be said about a book that you can't put down, and that's what this was for me.
Very good.
Hey,
thanks.
Weysan, can I add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wrote this book with the perspective for other police chiefs, other executives, to help them, just from my experience, how can we get the best of the media? How can we utilize the media and to kind of know and maneuver that terrain, the best that we can do to put our product out as good as we can? And one of the things, does anybody ever watch wrestling in here? So in wrestling, there's the good guys called the baby face. And that baby face will come out and the crowd will go crazy, right? That's called heat. Then the bad guy comes out and the bad guy's called the heel. And it doesn't matter if they're cheering loud for the heel too. It's all heat. All heat's good, whether it's good or bad. So what I think is going to be fun with this panel is I wanted a panel that would challenge my book. Look, I know Adam's an expert in communication. Waverly's a seasoned professional in the real world. Justin is somebody that I've worked with in the academic world on quite a few studies and quite a few things. I wanted their tough feedback, and it's going to play out to have a very fun question and answer session as we go on. But as I just want to point a couple chapters out. Chapter 1 covers Carrie Orozco's death. Her 10-year anniversary is May 20th. Her family granted me alone permission to write about the day she died. It comes from, it's just that first 24 hours. It's graphic, and but it needed to be archived for our community. Chapter 8 is on race, police, and the media. That's an interesting chapter that hasn't been written before. And Chapter 9 is called Media Self-Rule and its Effects on Law Enforcement. And that's about the only time in the book that I paint the media in a negative light, because my theme throughout this book is very professional. I view the media as a very professional entity, at least in Omaha. Chapter 9 gets into some examples that you all might find interesting.
So are we the heels and you're the babyface?
You're both. You're both.
Well, clearly, everybody got a lot out of the book, which is not surprising. As I said, I think it's excellent. All of our panelists submitted questions in advance, so I want to touch on a couple of those. And I'll start with Chief Schmaderer to follow up on really what's recently been said. Chief, you talk in the book about building a championship team culture where officers hold each other accountable. How do you go about developing that kind of a culture?
Yeah, let me explain what I mean by that first. And I think the final wave in policing, for real professional policing, is that championship culture. And I feel Omaha Police is on the cusp of it. When you're trying to establish a culture for a law enforcement agency, especially a large one, when I have 1,200 employees, you got to be cognizant on how you message, how you establish the culture. And we do it from the minute they step foot in the academy. Everything's culturized on everything they do, and we preach professionalism on everything. There's a professional way to make an arrest. There's a professional way to talk to a little kid that's just interrupted your lunch. There is a professional way to utilize lethal force if the circumstances are that grave. So we preach professionalism all the way through, and that's how we try to establish our culture, and then it's holding people accountable. I can tell you that there are various stages that police departments go through as to whether or not how close they get to that championship team culture. It's a progression. I'll kind of walk you through Omaha Police's progression. When I fired 4 officers in 2013, look, the agency was looking at me like, who is this guy? He just fired 4 of us. Okay, there wasn't buy-in at that point. The community had the buy-in, about 100%. And so the police department employees started realizing, wait a minute, the community is behind this particular move. They started reevaluating things. Now, if an officer gets fired, it's very rare to receive any pushback from the employees. They're kind of like, you can't do that around here. We know what the rules are. We know what the culture is. And so chiefs across the country, they're willing to hold their people accountable. You're not going to find a chief that doesn't. If there is a chief or a sheriff out there that doesn't want to hold their people accountable, they're going to be short-lived. Okay, they'll get washed out eventually. Chiefs will hold people accountable. The next phase in that progression is, will your first-line supervisors hold people accountable? Will they bring things forward and hold people accountable, send them to internal affairs? In Omaha, we have both of that. The third phase is that championship team culture. When the Los Angeles Lakers had Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and they were winning all those championships, they didn't really need a coach. They didn't need a chief. They didn't need supervision because the players supervised themselves. If somebody showed up late, you had to answer to Magic Johnson. Championship team culture is when that officer walks into that roll call room, if that officer next to him says, you're not going to do what you did on that call any further, not when I'm around. That's championship team culture. And that is the progression that I think all police departments should go to. And quite frankly, that progression gets forced upon police departments sometimes. I think George Floyd, I think the Michael Brown situation, I think all these things that occur forced law enforcement agencies to get up to speed. And when I look at the 2020 civil unrest all across this country, really the professional police departments already had done everything that the protest was asking for, already had done it. What that did for this world is it forced all the police departments that hadn't kept up or faked keeping up, forced them all to get in the line to best practices. And so the final stage is something you can't force, and that's that championship team culture. And will the officers hold each other accountable? Because when they do, you're going to have an extremely good organization. And that's what I mean by championship team culture.
Great, thanks. Waverle, I'm curious, from your standpoint as a practitioner of media, does the media do the same sort of thing? And what are your reactions to what the chief just said?
Well, I can't speak for management, I guess, but because I'm not there. But I will say that I definitely do outside looking in, when I look at Schmaderer, Omaha Police Department, I do see that accountability level. And I think that's shown through the examples that you provided, but also, when we get the press releases and things like that and the process of things. So I do think, like you said, you're on the cusp of that team, and I think that that's very true. How does a news station hold their reporters accountable? I always say the best and most professional way to tell a story is to make sure that it is factually correct and that you are professional presenting it. I shouldn't be smiling if I'm talking about someone who died, right? I shouldn't, but I also can crack a smile if it's a lighthearted story where a police officer is accepting an award, right? So also, I'll never forget, earlier in my career, we were at a scene, and it's very easy to get desensitized. I don't think that that is uncommon for a news reporter. If you're constantly on the crime beat and you're constantly showing up, sometimes you kind of forget that you're approaching a scene that doesn't happen to the people that it's happened to, daily, right? And so you have to be mindful of that. And I'll never forget, we were streaming back. We weren't live or anything like that, but we were just streaming it back so that we could get video recorded and then get it on air. And I had said something like, gosh darn it, I forgot my jacket. And I kind of laughed with my photographer about it. And I immediately got a call from my assignment director. And he said, hey, you're on. We can hear you back here. Stop talking like that. And I was like, you know what, you're right, because someone was shot, and I'm worried about my jacket when this family is worried about, their loved one. And so, and I don't mind sharing that story because I think a lot of those are learning curves, right? And while no one heard me, the family didn't hear me, it was important that when I knew I was coming to a scene like that I act appropriate. And I'll never forget that story because I turned red in the face and then had to go live 15 minutes later. And I'm pretty sure I looked like I had way too much blush on, but I just tell you it's because I was embarrassed. So, I think that's another way. That's one way that I have been held accountable. Also, when we write a story, we make sure that we have people that are higher up than us, our management team. They proof our stories and they challenge us. They say, well, why'd you write it this way? Or can I see that document so that I can proofread and things like that? Because it is important, because you only really have one time. Doesn't matter if you scrub it from the internet or you don't cut it to put it on the internet. Someone at home still watched that. And so if we air something wrong, then that becomes their truth. But it's not true. And it doesn't matter if you redact it. It's still out there. And someone's going to believe it. So because of, the media is a trustworthy, organization. I say KETV is very trustworthy, and I would hope that I have credibility with people who watch me. But that is, accountability is more internal, but also I try to also make sure that viewers see me as accountable as well. I try not to, I advocate a lot for showing up in North Omaha, because we shouldn't just go to North Omaha because there's a shooting. We can go there for the good stuff, right? We don't have to just only be in a certain part of Omaha when the good stuff or the bad stuff is only happening in those parts, right? We can find something. I mean, Omaha's big, right? So there's always going to be good stuff everywhere. So that's how I hold myself accountable. And then lastly, I want to point out too that, with viewers, you're a team, right? When you see someone come up to your door or ask you a question and they're wearing a KETV polo, or that they're with KETV, if you have a bad interaction with them, then maybe if I go a year later or a month later to go try to interview that same person and they see that I'm with KETV, but they had a bad interaction from a previous reporter, I've had a lot of times where they say, well, I'm not talking to you, I'm only talking to WWT because I had a bad interaction with one of your photographers 10 years ago. This one guy remembered that the attitude, I guess, that he perceived with one of our former reporters, and he told me about it. And I was like, I'm so sorry, I'm not that person. Would you still mind talking to me about your experience? And he was like, no, I don't want to. And Six got the exclusive story. And so, those are ways too that you have to be mindful when you're interacting with people, that's so important, because you're either meeting people on the best day or the worst day of their life. And those memories are going to stick with them. So that's how I would say that the media, KTV, me specifically, holds myself and my colleagues to a higher standard.
Great, thanks. One of the other questions that was submitted, which I think would be interesting to this audience, since we have a lot of criminal justice students here, is what do you think, Chief, what do you think the number one challenge facing police departments today is?
The number one challenge facing police departments today is, well, right now it's just going to be staffing. You have your major cities across this country facing a severe staffing shortage. You had all police departments facing a staffing shortage after 2020. But what's repopulated into our profession, which I think is starting to make a comeback, it really is starting to make a comeback. You look at UNO, there's more enrollees into their criminal justice program really than ever right now. That's start of a comeback. The smaller agencies, the suburbs, have filled up first. So you do that, you go to major cities all across this country and you look at the suburbs, they're populating their police departments faster than the big cities are. And what we're seeing is there's still people that want to be in law enforcement, but they're choosing what they perceive to be a less dangerous environment. Policing in a major city is intense. You're gonna see a lot of things. And while it can be intense everywhere, the volume isn't there. So they're choosing to go to those agencies first. So it's leaving your major cities lower staffed. And that's probably the biggest problem facing the police departments across this country. There's two very identical police departments, Minneapolis and Omaha. They're very, very identical. Very similar in population. Minneapolis has an authorized strength of 908 officers. Omaha Police has an authorized strength of 906. The epicenter of George Floyd was Minneapolis. They now have about 530 officers that police their entire city. About 530. They should have 908. Omaha Police, we're down quite a few, over 100 ourselves. We probably have 770 out of our 906. So when we're feeling it here at 770, imagine what Minneapolis is feeling at 500 some. And you see that replicated all across this country. So the goal for executives right now is, how do we turn this around? You see a pay wave increase. This job of policing is going to be an incredible job in 5 years because the free market took over. Because of the vacancies and because of the dire need to have police officers, everybody started raising their pay all across the country. We even attempted to do that here in Omaha. I think it'll pass the city council. We took a strike to say, all right, Omaha Police, no matter what, will be 5% higher in pay than any law enforcement agency in this state because we're that much bigger. We have that much more requirements of us. Our attempt is to bring our population of the police department back up so we can continue to keep crime down. So what we're facing in Omaha is a national problem. And chiefs all across this country will convene, and that is the biggest subject, Weysan.
Okay, great, thank you. Do any of our professors or Waverle, do you have any thoughts on what you think the biggest challenge is? Anything regarding what the chief said or your own perspective?
I'll co-sign the staffing problem. I know that this is true that a lot of agencies are understaffed right now, and I think one thing that makes it really hairy is that crime rates fluctuate for a lot of reasons, some of which has to do with what the police are good and maybe not so good at doing in the community, but also for other reasons that are really beyond the control of the police. And so I think one thing that's going to be challenging in the years ahead is as agencies are currently short-staffed, and as we've had these conversations about moving money away from the police and investing it in other areas of the community, being able to tell that story about why. I tell my students that police department is kind of like a piece of Laffy Taffy in that you can stretch it thin. They're going to continue to provide at least their baseline services, even if they have to take away from certain units or discontinue certain programs. But at some point, you keep stretching it, it's going to break, right? And so I don't think we as a field in criminology really understand what that baseline is. It might look very different from community to community, even in Minneapolis that looks in a lot of ways similar to Omaha. But being able to justify the sworn number, right, the authorized number, and being able to indicate why that number is needed to be able to provide this level of services, right? So going back to those conversations with the community about what policing in the community means or should mean, being able to articulate, this is why we need 906 officers, right? And even in times when, right now we're enjoying a period of low crime relative to where it was a few years ago in many cities, because I think it becomes really tempting for folks who don't have experience in working in law enforcement or understand the intricacies of providing public safety. It becomes really tempting to say, well, look, we just lost 20% of the agency, but crime's down year over year, right? So maybe it's a good thing that we lost 20% of our agency. And maybe in the short term it is okay, but I do worry about longer term, right? You keep stretching that piece of Laffy Taffy, it will break eventually. And like the chief said, I think we've seen the free market respond. I was out on the West Coast a couple years ago and saw billboards about agencies trying to basically steal talent away from major cities, right? Out in the suburbs. Hey, come work for us. We'll give you a $100,000 sign-on bonus. And that's not an exaggeration. I saw 6-figure sign-on bonuses being offered for officers in Portland and Seattle, for example, to come work out in the burbs where maybe you got a little more community support than you have right now in the inner cities. Again, that's like a temporary, like a Band-Aid solution. I think the reason we have this staffing shortage that we see is like a perfect storm of events, right? You've got all of those cops that were hired in the 90s on the crime bill with that federal sort of shot in the arm of money to hire officers. Well, they're now at retirement age, right? And then you had the fallout from the George Floyd murder up in Minneapolis, right? And all of the criticism on policing. A lot of cops, decided maybe this isn't for me. And oh, by the way, we were in that pandemic where like our sort of traditional way of thinking about having to go into the office got challenged. We realized a lot of jobs could be done, remotely, and you could have the freedom or the flexibility to work from home. Law enforcement isn't really that job, right? You can't work from home as a police officer. And so I think generationally, you've got this new sort of cohort of individuals who are at that age to go into law enforcement saying, that's not really an appealing job to me. Even if the financial incentive is there, they're not thinking long-term about their pensions. They're thinking about the flexibility to be able to work from home when they want to, or, they're thinking short-term. I'll do this for a few years and then I'll go work somewhere else. And so I think that's a real challenge as agencies try to get back to where they were when, I've heard it say, I think you say in the book that you guys used to get 2,000 applications a year, and then a couple years ago, less than 400. And of those 400, only so many will be qualified, only so many will see through to the end of the academy and so forth and be road ready a year from their hire date, right? So that's a really big challenge, I think, going forward. And I don't really have the answers to it other than we need to be thinking about how to broaden that pool of interested people. So thinking about being very intentional about what we put in those recruitment materials. We just had our career fair here on campus last week. And, one way to reel the students in is to bring out the horses and the paddy wagons and all of that sort of exciting stuff. But then there's this balance of also communicating the realities of the job. You're not going to be jumping out of helicopters every day unless you're on a very, refined unit like SWAT or something. You're not going to be going in and diffusing bombs every day. You're more likely going to be doing paperwork and stuff that isn't quite as exciting, right? So how do we portray the realities of the job and recruit the best talent and retain them? I think that's a question we really need to have an answer to sooner than later.
Very good, thank you.
If I could jump in on that really quick. Cities and law enforcement have stories to tell. And I think one of the things that we can look at through a messaging situation is what story is being told. What story is being told about the city? What story is being told about the law enforcement agency? What story is being told about the people involved with that law enforcement agency? Minneapolis, their police force has had a bad story, whether it's true or not, for a long time. When I grew up in that area, you didn't go to North Minneapolis. That was just kind of the rule that you lived by. It was a fine place to go. It was fine. It was just you didn't go. Omaha has a story to tell, and the police have a story to tell. If that story can be developed, if that story can be, and not sugar-coated and not whatever, but it can be an honest story, it starts to explore and invite those various stakeholders, those various audiences, those various community members, all those into the same conversation. And suddenly those community members and those stakeholders realize that there is a a symbiotic relationship. And if you can get that relationship to occur and then maintain it, and that's always the biggest trick, is the maintenance of it, suddenly you will possibly see people who won't see being on the force as either A, I'm pencil pushing, or B, I get to jump out of helicopters every day. Rather, it's service. I think sometimes that story gets lost. I wonder if that is a story that could be told, which what might move. I'm not going to solve the problem here, but when I look at the world as narratives. I look at the world as stories. That might be what is going on, is what story is being told. And that might be a starting point to get that conversation going.
Yep, very interesting. I like that approach. One of the other questions that was submitted, you talked a little bit earlier about the different stakeholders and different constituencies you have to deal with. And in Omaha, I think as Waverle mentioned, we're very fortunate that the department is well regarded pretty much throughout all the different constituencies. So the question is, how have you gone about, what are the strategies you've used, and how have you gone about developing those relationships between and across different entities, sometimes entities which have differing needs and references? For example, what your officers need versus what the mayor's office may need versus what city council versus the different communities of Omaha and the media. So how have you balanced all that?
Yeah, the one thing I will say when you're an executive in charge of anything large, is especially a police department, there's going to be a lot of arrows that come your way, whether it be through the union, whether it be through the community, the media, national interest groups. I mean, you name it, they're going to be flying at you constantly. So you have to be intentional with what you want to do with relationships, first and foremost, but it also has to be embedded in the culture of the agency, because you're just one person. You're just one person as the chief, and you need your people to be ambassadors for your police department as well. So if you're the greatest executive in the world, it's not going to do a whole lot of good if that's countermanded and undermined from your subordinates down below every time they have contact with somebody. Mm-hmm. One of the analogies I always use is this analogy. Let's say a law enforcement agency just has 1% of their officers are not what you consider very professional. Just 1%. You would say to yourself, well, Chief, that's pretty good agency, 1%. And I would say, absolutely, that's a great number. That's a slice of society. Probably every profession has 1% that isn't as professional as you would like. But in policing, 1% of 1,000 officers is what? 10 officers. That seems low, doesn't it? But those 10 officers are going to have 20 to 30 to 40 citizen contacts a day. Now, all of a sudden, you have 400 citizen contacts where you're just like, wow. Now you see how that small group can really damage things. So a couple of things that we do is make it very intentional. We really push police-community relations. We feel that's our best way to reduce crime. One thing I will say, every couple of years there's a tremendous festival that goes on. It's called the Native Omaha Days in Omaha. It's every other year. It's in North Omaha. And when I first started as chief, none of the officers wanted to work it. They thought it was horrible. They didn't want to work down at this environment. Now, the sign-up list is too much to accommodate. Everybody wants to work it because police-community relations has grown. Because the community wanted to be in a relationship with us, and we wanted to be in a relationship back, and then we saw progress, we saw the results, and the momentum took off. When you look at other cities and you don't see that progress, it's probably because one side or the other, the police or the community, isn't quite sure about being in that relationship. They might be faking it, okay? And so we really spent a lot of time on that. And then to wrap up this question, as chief, I used the press, I used the media very early on to get my messages out. If I had a major event, if I had something that was drawing me to do a press conference live, I did use that opportunity to give social commentary on what our expectations are and what society means to us. And that allowed one person to reach 500,000 people. And so we intentionally did that, as well as just describing what took place that brought us there on that incident.
Time to open it up for audience questions. I don't know how we're doing for time, so. I guess if anybody has a question, raise your hand, and Professor Freeman Wakefield will bring the microphone to you.
I promise these guys I'd move slow because.
Thank you. Tila Mickles with Compassion in Action, and I also serve on the mayor's Citizen Complaint Review Board. She literally assigned me. I wasn't voted in. And so I'm in that area where I actually work with people that are in prison for like 40 years. And then I understand the relationships that Chief Schmaderer has built over the past 18 years, mostly through his collaboration with Empowerment Network. And my question is, you know, there are several individuals who are former something, and now their script has been flipped because they have met you, and you have that open door policy, and there are individuals that would die before they were ever in the room with police officer, let alone the chief. It seems to me one of the hindrances is the education requirement. Have you thought about, you know, revisiting that? Because you might have some individuals who are very gifted and very talented, would have the ability, but that education piece, I think some of them they're not there.
Yeah, that's a great question, especially as it relates to our staffing situation as well. So the law, it's actually a city ordinance. You have to have a high school diploma is the minimum to be hired by the Omaha Police Department. However, it really does seem that we don't get anybody through the door with just that. There's either some type of military background or they have a college degree of some sort. And you're right, Tila, the ones that we have hired that have come straight from the military, or they have some job experience but they don't have a degree, have worked out for us. What we do when we hire is, first and foremost, you have to have a clean background. We only keep about 8 or 9% of those that apply. That's why I need 2,000 people to apply, because we only take about 8 or 9% of those. If I don't, you might run into problems down the road that we don't want to deal with. So one thing that I ask is, you have to show me some area of success in your life once you pass our background, or we can't hire you. Whether it's success in sports, maybe it's in the theater, maybe it's in academics, maybe it's solving a neighborhood problem. You have to show us that, because you're going to be putting on a uniform, and you will be the authority once you leave that building. That police officer, that entry-level position, is going to be in charge of what they come in contact with. And sometimes you cannot gauge how a person will respond when they have that authority. You try to train it, you try to drill it in, but it is not the same, and you can't always gauge that. And so that's why the hiring practice, and that's why everything is so important. To be a lieutenant within the Omaha Police Department, that's when they require a college degree. That's kind of a mid-level manager. And then you get up to the chief's level, and you need a master's degree. So that's kind of how that works. We're very open to taking candidates that don't have a degree, as long as they show us one level of success in their life that we can hang on to and say, okay, when you put that uniform on, you can solve somebody else's problems. And a lot of times there's a bit of a bias towards degrees, because that is at least something they've showed us. They've showed us that dedication to get that degree. And so I think your point's well taken, especially in the environment, especially what I've seen as well. The right person is the right person sometimes.
So I'm curious, Professor Nix, from your standpoint as a criminal justice professor, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, I think everyone should get their education, particularly here at UNO, and I think it's great that the chief,
I expected no
the
less.
chief had to have a graduate degree, even if it was from Cincinnati. We'll accept that, I guess. No, I think there's good reasons to want students. I think to be able to demonstrate that they were committed to something for a 4-year period, that they were able to meet deadlines, that they were able to meet threshold, get their papers in, right, pass their tests. I've heard it said that, of course I disagree, that criminal justice or criminology is a useless degree from people who've worked a career and retired. They feel like maybe they didn't learn the skills in the classroom that served them later in their careers. But again, I go back to the point that like Chief Schmaderer is making, that you've got to be able to demonstrate success in some capacity, before you came to us. And, following through on a college education is one way to do that. I also think it's a period in your life where you do a lot of growing and developing and maturing. And the college environment is the perfect place, I think, to do a lot of that stuff. But there are good reasons, I think, as we consider how to improve our recruitment pool, to rethink a lot of those traditional requirements. A lot of agencies have begun to roll back like facial hair restrictions, tattoo restrictions. That stuff's easy. Once you start talking about, okay, we're willing to lower the bar for education, systematically, you're naturally going to hear concerns about, are we now lowering standards, right? If we don't require this 2 or this 4-year degree that we historically have. And I think, the jury would be out on that, right? Because like you say, there are other ways, I think, to demonstrate a capability to do the job, and a diploma doesn't necessarily indicate that. So I don't have I'm going to hedge my bet like any good researcher and say I don't know that we have good evidence one way or the other. But I think there are, other levers that could be pulled before we get to that. And it's reassuring to hear that there's like a fail-safe in place where that's not necessarily a hard rule if you can demonstrate success in other ways.
Hey, Weysan, I'd like to add on to that, just because I've got a collective audience of students here as well. When you're short-staffed, you do have to adapt with the times, and the times evolves. There's a state law mandates a lot of the requirements that force an automatic disqualification onto a candidate sometimes. For instance, if you've used marijuana within the last 2 years, or a marijuana product or derivative of any sort within 2 years, we can't hire you. And that generally will come out, if it's not disclosed, it comes out in the polygraph. The problem that we run into here is you can walk into any CBD store, Delta store, vape store, I'm not really sure on the names, and you can go buy a Delta 8 or Delta 9 legally. You walk right in and buy it. Well, then that candidate comes into the Omaha Police Department, and they've asked, well, have you ever used a Delta 8 or Delta 9? Well, of course I have. I was at this party. My girlfriend gave me one a year ago. Boom, this perfect candidate now has to be disqualified for a year. And so what we've been advocating for is a change in the law, a recognition of some of the advancement of times. Tattoos used to be strictly forbidden. They're not taboo anymore. Beards used to be prohibitive. I think we find beards to be fine now. Everybody, it's so advanced with the times, especially Tyma's. He's his great beard. So, as a chief, we have to advance with the times, because I will tell you, when I have to let 12 people put on the back burner and constantly keep up with them for 2 years until their window's up is not fair to that person. It's not fair to the community. And the laws have to be adaptive with the times, and law changes are slow.
So Adam or Waverle, do you have any thoughts on what should the public expect, or what's reasonable for the public to expect in terms of education for police officers?
I don't necessarily have a response. I more had a question. Do you guys think that maybe the kind of societal change of no longer having to go do a 4-year degree maybe also impacted staffing, like with the trade schools being kind of pushed more in high schools and things like that? Just with stories I've done regarding admissions into college campuses, I wonder if that's also maybe played not a huge, but a smaller factor in, that.
I'm not really sure on that. I think there is a space for that. I thought Dr. Nix hit on something earlier that really resonated with me. We're still 365 days a year, 7 days a week, working holidays, working evenings. You start on the police department, it's a seniority base. You're going to work evenings. You're going to work overnights. That's tough to compete with Google. It's tough to compete with LinkedIn, where you could take a nap in the middle of the day. Okay? I mean, I'm glad that got some laughter, but I wasn't meaning that to be funny. And so I can't really offer that environment where I say, all right, for an hour, I'm going to have a bunch of video games and a napping pod, and you just put your duties aside and come sleep. So we're competing with that environment. And so the messaging piece that Adam brought up earlier in our start a conversation of how we turn this around probably needs to accommodate a more positive message out there rather than, okay, we're short-staffed because of trauma that occurred in our country and the profession got smacked around. We probably need to quit talking about that and message this better as this is the greatest job in the world. You're going to feel something when you help somebody. You're going to feel something when you make a difference, and we pay you well now. Maybe that's the new messaging.
I think just to capitalize on that too, I think that a lot of those same sentiments go for news. I mean, you see it nationally, the decline in people wanting to be journalists anymore. And, I think that maybe the messaging does need to change for journalists, but also too, the climate has changed, right? So you can have a podcast now and call yourself a journalist and, whatever you want to do, so you can be a citizen journalist and, share your stories on Facebook. So, I think just as things have evolved, maybe there's room for, involvement with, news organizations, in up the corporate ladder, of course.
Can I jump in on that really quick?
Sure.
So, sweet. We'll swap. We'll be good to go. Now let's do it this way. I would actually do a both and on that. I think you have to recognize the fact that something incredible happened a few years ago. Like there was this event that occurred. I don't think that's a story that we can walk away from. And if you recognize that with what you're trying to construct now as the police department, as this space in the community, merging those together is a more honest message. Yes, this happened, and look what we're accomplishing now. If you're looking at it, I'll use the term, I've got colleagues here rhetorically, the argument you're constructing there is a stronger argument because you're not discounting the event and you're recognizing what you've done since that to try and say, hey, yes, we know this happened and we're still here and we're actually improving since then. I think that would be a better holistic message to work with than denying what happened prior. I want to throw it out there.
Okay, good, thank you. Do we have any other audience questions? More there? Okay.
Thank you so much. My name is Terry Crawford. I teach a class called Law in the Black Community. And much of our conversations in the class, I've taught it for about 17 years now. Much of our conversations in the class center around how policing looks, feels, and actually is different in predominantly Black communities in comparison to communities that are not. Ferguson was a really good example of that. Minneapolis was a really good example of that. And there's no shortage of cities across the nation that are really good examples of that. So we look at it from a historical perspective and what that looked like throughout our history. And then we just pull headlines in a contemporary sense as to what that looks like right now. So my question is, how do you, or have you addressed it? And I must admit, I haven't read the book, but I will buy it. You mentioned in chapter 8 that you talk about race and policing and what that looks like. There's some conversations we could definitely have in Omaha about what that looks like. In addition to being in the classroom, I also practice criminal defense. So I see it and I hear it all of the time as to what that looks like when stops were made or when there's certain language that shows up in police reports that seems to be canned language. Seems to be, I'll say that. So there are some things that are happening that policing looks different in a Black community compared to what it looks like in other communities. How do we address that? It's not just a perception, but it's actually factual that happens. And then how do we move towards changing what that looks like? And if that was something that you dealt with in chapter 8 of your book.
That's an absolute amazing question. And you're right on all aspects of that. One of the things I like to do is I like to start out with common ground. And I will tell you, it's been my experience that that our community of color and myself have aligned on a lot of things. And I think chiefs across this country and communities of color have some common ground and alliances right from the start. The first one is the branch of government in place to protect society should not harm anyone because of race. Chiefs and the communities agree on that. Two, there's a prove it to me attitude, especially in black communities, that we find reasonable. There is historical issues that you mentioned that are in play that cause people to view things differently. Chiefs and communities of color both agree on that. And we understand why there's skepticism, and policing has to even be more professional to overcome it. Three, law enforcement hiring, training, and culture need to be strong to prevent negative encounters because of race. We want to try to minimize those. So the culture and hiring and training have to be very good. Communities, chiefs of police, we totally agree on that front. Four, black communities will accept and embrace positive and professional policing, for which is something chiefs of police strive for. The one thing I've noticed, when there's product and progress, we're acknowledged for it. It doesn't erase all the negatives that have ever occurred, but there's at least that acknowledgement. So we agree on that as well. And five is positive police-community relationships are valued and imperative. There's a survey out, and it showed that 81% of those surveyed in communities of color, they want more police. We totally agree, and we both agree that we just want good policing. And so I like to start out with those five commonalities, and then we I try to spread those culture down. I try to use that to establish a foundation, and it kind of stems from there. You troubleshoot together, you formulate strategies together, you highlight your wins, you work on your deficiencies, and you give each other credit, and you try to own this together. Some cities, when things go bad, everybody's looking at the mayor, everybody's looking at the chief of police, and that was probably the case here 15 years ago, but not anymore. Now the community says, okay, we've had this series of shootings. We own this with law enforcement. We own this, and that's why Omaha has reduced crime so greatly. So we started out with those commonalities. It took us here, and I read that from the end of chapter that covers race in here. I can't wait for you to read it and give me your feedback on that.
You know, in Omaha, we have an entity known as Omaha 360, which years ago, I'm proud to say I actually had a hand in starting. It's done a remarkable job. I don't know if Todd or if anybody else on the panel who's knowledgeable of that, wants to expound on it, because it's a great model, and I think it's very effective in terms of the community and the department working together. Yeah, it really is. Empowerment Network 360 started 18 years ago, and it started in the community, and basically the community said, a couple of members of the community said, well, look, we're tired of this violence. We're at odds with the police. Unfortunately, we need to work together to resolve this matter. The chief of police at the time, Chief Tom Warren, did the heavy lifting. He did the heavy lifting, and he took the hits, and he helped form a relationship between police and community. And then some other chiefs started taking it higher and higher and higher, and I was fortunate enough to be in that progression point where it was established. What I did was accelerate it more, emphasize it even more, because I had the benefit of what they didn't have. I saw that it was working. And because of that, we doubled down on it to a tremendous level. Now, every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, and it's been going on for 18 years, you can go there and see it for yourself. 100 people will show up, the police will be there, and we interact, and we troubleshoot, and we solve problems together, and we own things together. You're probably not going to find that in any other city. And so when I talk about crime reduction, I think the police department does a great job. I think the community has a major factor into it. But the other thing that we do is we deal with root causes, educational gaps, poverty gaps, breakdowns of the family. All those things are improving in Omaha that play into this low crime rate that we have. A lot of that stemmed from those early on meetings 18 years ago when the community and the police department were in a room together looking at each other like, I don't know if I trust you, I don't know if I trust you. Now nobody's looking at each other that way, at least in the confines of that room. And so there's a success story there to build upon, and I hope we're trying to transfer that all across the country.
I know the Empowerment Network 360 has got invites all across the country to go talk to. They'll be in Lansing, Michigan next week. I was just in New Orleans for the very same thing. So there's a story here that we hope can be replicated in Omaha, in Kansas City, Memphis, so many cities I can't even tell you that are adopting this model. And the one thing I always tell them, it's an 18-year process here, but it's got to start somewhere. So when they're starting it out, it's interesting for me to hear their feedback because it's exactly what we went through. And so, I mean, great credit to our community mostly for why we are where we are.
I just wanted to chime in really quick on 360. 360 is now my beat, basically. So I attend the 360 meetings weekly, and you know, I love everything about it. But one of the things that I really enjoy is when you walk into that room, you know, you can be candid, right? You can ask questions, and there's been opportunities when I've been able to ask at least you, Todd, at least one question, but then also, you know, I had another personnel within the police force. I was asking him about the clearance rate, and he was able to kind of dive it into me. And it's just nice to be able to have those conversations because I'm not necessarily like taking it to go report on it, right? But I just like to have like the context of what like the clearance rate really means. And so when I'm reporting it, I understand it, right? And so, but I think what's really amazing, another great thing that's really amazing to see is to just sit back and watch when there is an issue brought up at 360, maybe a police interaction that someone didn't like, that didn't go well, or they felt like, you know, and they can air out those frustrations, but then the police are right there to say, okay, let's talk about this afterwards, or like, let's get to the bottom of this, or like, come have a conversation with me. Like, let's really figure out what's going on. And then another thing that's great, because we always love a follow through, is that the next week they talk about it, you know, like what happened. And so what they were able to do, or they just say, you know, we got the problem solved. And so walking in and being able to kind of like let go of those barriers and just make those connections, I think is really important, because I think that you can see it in the community's eyes that really does go a long way. I think it goes a long way for me too, as being a journalist, to really see that happening is it's really cool. So yeah.
Great. Do we have one more question?
Yes. Hi, my name is Hamida, and I am a graduate. I graduated from UNO, and I currently work at state probation, but I also teach a class at UNO. I guess I'm interested because I've noticed an increase of the presence of law enforcement, police officers in the community during events with recruiting tables, as well as a lot of presence in social media and posts like that. We live in the world of like TikTok, Instagram, and Instagram Reels, and all of the influencers that we have. I'm interested in your views or thoughts regarding the presence of law enforcement on social media, and whether you think of it as community policing or not.
That's a great question. First of all, you work for state probation, and you're going for your graduate degree or undergraduate degree?
I already graduated.
Nice, nice. And I expect an application filled out by you by the end of the week, perhaps? Look, a couple years ago, maybe about 5 years ago, my staff came to me and they said, Chief, we want to get into TikTok. We were in all the other social media. And I do think you can reach the population with social media, but it's limited. It can't be a one-trick pony, because you do have to have that FaceTime, and you do have to go out and present and be real and be seen. And I said, I wasn't too familiar with this TikTok. And they said, well, you know, a lot of our applicants are mentioning that we don't have TikTok. This was like 5 years ago. So I said, all right, do it. Do you know, in like 3 days, we got over 100,000 people following us on TikTok. So now we use social media as a major recruitment tool. We also use it to clarify a message when something big occurs. And, you know, in our line of work, sometimes rumor and supposition will fill the gaps as to what happened. One of the first things we do is put out a press release and do social media saying the Omaha Police Department is the official source of information. We will update you at this time, and this place. And that's all designed so rumors and supposition don't fill the gaps. So the whole social media scene has just been this tremendous dynamic that you can reach a ton of people. But it's got some drawbacks too. It's got some drawbacks because those rumors, And innuendos can spread like wildfire because everybody else has social media as well. In the book, I talk about utilizing the professional journalism of professional journalists to counteract some of the negative bloggers, social media pieces that don't have the same journalistic code of ethics that KETV will have. And so what I talk about in the book, sometimes you have to dispel those rumors. And you can't always go to somebody's page and try to dispel that rumor and be heard. So we try to work with the legitimate media, which, by the way, if that goes under in this country, it's a huge problem. I'm just telling you that. It's a huge problem. Newspapers across this country, the major newspapers, are starting to go under. I see the World Herald staffing is way down. Everybody's way down. Look, that's your watchdog for society, okay? That's your watchdog. We're your watchdog on some things, but who's going to watch city government? Who's going to keep everybody on their toes if the major newspapers and entities go down? I'm just telling you, it'll be bad. The corruption level will skyrocket across this country. So that's kind of how I view social media. I view it very positively, but I have an asterisk to it, or two, let's put it that way. All right, thank you.
So I think we're nearing the end.
I'm sorry, can I just have a quick
Sure.
clarification? Because I don't know, sometimes I see on social media too, is people maybe don't, viewers, maybe don't understand the difference between like what the Omaha Police Officers Association posts versus OPD. And so can you just clarify that for the audience on the difference there?
Right. So the chief of police, my command staff, we run the Omaha Police Department. If there's a crime, if there's discipline, anything that goes on in the day-to-day operations, Omaha Police Department, we're the ones in charge. But like a lot of careers, there is a union, and the Omaha Police Officers Association is the union for the Omaha police officers. So they also have a voice, and their voice is to advocate for their members. And they will do that, and they will do that, and at times, management and the union don't always see eye to eye. I see better than them. They don't realize it yet, but there are competing messages out there, and that is a serious challenge on establishing a culture. Quite frankly, competing messages are very difficult to combat as an executive when you realize you don't have ultimate control of that message at times.
Can I jump on that really quick? The reason I want to, thank you. So one of the classes I teach is Intro to Mass Comm. It's a sometimes large lecture, sometimes not, 25 students, intro, freshman level class. I ask the question typically within the first week, where do you trust your information to come from? It is rare that someone says, I trust legacy media. I'm going to say it bluntly. What they trust is what they get in their feeds. So the idea here then is, how do you, and I'm saying not just you, but you, how do you capitalize on that? How do you utilize that? And I think by jumping on TikTok, not knowing what it is, but yeah, let's go there, that's the smart move. Understanding how to message in that space is equally as important. And what's good to see is that what we call our legacy media, our television, our print, our radio, are doing that and utilizing it in such a way, because the ability to repost, the ability to share, the ability to clip, if you're in TikTok, the ability to duet on that and bring things in, is you can do it instantaneously, and everyone's phone is a production studio. And so if you keep that in mind, you're going to be able to work on not only controlling message as much as you can, because you can't control the message 100%, but also ensuring that it's getting to the right people at the right time. And so if you are in the space where you're thinking, we don't need to do this, you need to do it. Just, you need to understand that environment, because that is where information is being disseminated at a speed you cannot fathom. You think you can, and you look and go, nope, I can't understand that. It's that fast. And the trick is, so many new platforms are launching all of the time. Being able to keep up with it is going to drive any PIO nuts. And so I would say it's got to be a both and. Utilize legacy media as you're doing, utilize social media, But remember that different audiences, different messages, unique spaces. If you keep that in mind, it's going to save you a bunch of headache. Create some new headaches, but it's going to save you some headaches to be sure.
So with that, I think since we're almost at the end of our time, if we could, I'll ask each panel member to give any final thoughts they wish about the book or about what we've talked about, but please try to keep it to a minute or less, and then we'll end up with giving Chief Schmaderer the final word. So, Adam, do you want to do your 1 minute or less, or did you already do that?
Come on, I'm getting my stopwatch going. Speech and debate coach. Come on, here we go. So, what I would say is out of the book and out of this conversation, remember that the media folk you work with, to the Chief's point, are your peers. They are professionals. Understand that they have a job to do. If you are in law enforcement or you are in any sort of service space, you have a job to do. Understanding what those jobs are is going to make everyone's lives easier. The other thing I'll point out is that when it comes to understanding how an event occurs, work from all angles. Understand all of your audiences. Understand all the different spaces that you are going to be engaging with, including the ones you might not anticipate. If you can be open to that conversation, you can create a better story, you can create a better narrative, and get that moving forward. If you do not do that, you're going to run into problems, and that is not going to be a space you want to be in. So from the book, and I think from the conversation, that is where I would leave off at.
Great, thanks. Waverle, your last thoughts, 1 minute or less?
Yeah, I just would like to say that I really like the idea of like transparency versus trust that we talked about during this panel. I think I err on the side of transparency, being a journalist myself. So really being able to hear, or I should say read and listen to this panel talk about transparency and what works, when interacting with journalists and media, I think was very enlightening and reassures me that we are headed into down a path that creates good and stable relationships between law enforcement and journalists. And, I think when Todd Schmaderer says, I use the media to my advantage, we love that because because then we get something in our lap and we don't have to go chasing after it, which is very nice. And so, I think keeping that line of communication open is good. And again, like I said, headed in the right direction.
Great, thanks. Justin?
I agree with the Chief on a lot of things, but I keep going back to that 80s Lakers reference as championship culture. I definitely would have gone with 90s Bulls and Michael Jordan, but look, I think, go read the book for yourselves, right? Don't take our word for it. There's a lot to be learned here, I think, so it's a good read.
So before I pass it over to Todd for the final word, I will just say one of the sayings that I have had throughout my 30-year law enforcement career when I work with my partners and peers in the media was that the media and law enforcement actually are seeking the same goal. They both want to get to the truth. The only difference is the media wants to get the truth out on the 6 o'clock news. Law enforcement would prefer it to come out in the courtroom. But other than that, we're both seeking the truth. So with that, Todd, final thoughts?
Final thoughts are this. Alan Wakefield, Galen Armstrong, Mark Foxall, and the entire UNO criminal justice team is phenomenal. I'm telling you, I've had the opportunity to be around the country a little bit, work with some universities. Second to none here. I'm super proud of the fact that this book will be in its a college curriculum here in August of 2025. The whole goal is put as many students in the seats. Let's learn from this. I'm going to come back as a guest instructor. So you'll see me during the course of your semesters, and we can dive into this much further. As I look out at this room, I just want to thank everybody for coming to this. Appreciate your questions, and that's good enough for me. Thank you.
So how about, all right, to our panelists.
Well, good evening, everyone. Really appreciate your attention for this event. Another round of applause for our panelists, please. Weysan Dun, thank you for your expert moderating skills. From radio to Quantico, I did not know that. I did not know that. Expert job, sir, expert job. Okay, also another round of applause for our command structure that got this event here today. Also, Chief's already spoken to them. Thank you very much. For the students that are here, in particular my students are here, classes till 8:10, so you probably got about another 30 minutes to go. I'll talk a little bit about that later. On your desk, everyone, this event was at no cost, but on the tabletops is a QR code, and this is a criminal justice education fund, and for the students that are here, for the things that we do to try to provide for our students that are here, kind of think about digging into your pocket and making a little contribution to the education fund to further the education of our students to go out into this world and address a very complicated world, as the panelists have talked about, as our audience has talked about. And education is a lifelong process, so please help a little bit. The QR code is right here. Here it is. Here it is. Thank you very much. Okay. One last thing. I see several different books on the table, the Chief's books on the table around here. There's more out there. I'm sure that the Chief will stand by. He's got to hang around till 8:10 too with the students and sign some copies of the books. And if you go out to the left, the books are out there. And he's got a pen. It's got full of ink. I can see it right there. Please take advantage of that opportunity. With that, we are done for the night. Everyone, thank you very much.